Okay, let me share a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. So basically next year, I am hoping to work on a book project, the title of which and chapters are which are up here. And today, you're going to be the guinea pigs for chapter 3. So I basically have written out a rough draft of this chapter that I want to share with you. And I want to share a little bit of how I'm approaching these 4 classical arguments in a little bit of a different way. One of the ways that I'm approaching them a little bit differently is I'm thinking of them as abductive arguments, and I'm casting them as that. And I didn't know what that word meant until about 6 months ago. So when I think I heard Ken Samples mention it, so I just explained that very briefly. Abductive reasoning is just a different form of inference in formal logic from deductive arguments or inductive arguments. So in a deductive argument, you have premises, and then you reason from those premises to a conclusion, and the conclusion is certain. In inductive arguments, you have, I think I got a slide for this too. You have same kind of movement, but the conclusion is only probable. But abductive arguments work in the opposite direction. So you start with a present set of conditions, and then you're inferring backward to the best explanation. And you're saying, what's the best way to understand this? So, for example, if you have a roommate who loves Wendy's, and you wake up one morning and you see a bunch of half-eaten Wendy's on the kitchen counter, it's a reasonable inference to say this is from my roommate, but it's not logically guaranteed. It could have been that a burglar broke in and ate Wendy's and left it there. It could be something else like that. But I like using abductive arguments because it allows you to put the emphasis on what you have in common with the person that you're dialoguing with. And in some cases, and I'm going to say with the moral argument, it's a way that you can perhaps put them less like in the spotlight, a little bit less like a deer in headlights. And I don't think that's necessarily always better, but I think sometimes it can be a little bit more of a winsome approach. And I tend to talk to younger people, millennials like myself, and sometimes I just find this is a little bit more of a winsome approach, and I like using it. So that's the strategy I'm taking in this book. And then the second thing is I like to use narrative arguments. So I like to try to say that the 4 arguments together here are a way of telling a story. And I'm really interested in trying to appeal to both the head and the heart, both the plausibility and the beauty of the Christian worldview. So my goal, as I think about it, is that when people finish a chapter, they wouldn't just say, if it's been successful, that this is plausible, but that they would say, this is enchanting, this is thrilling, this is the best thing, I couldn't have made up something so good, especially when you get to the last chapter. I hope it will feel like when the children go through the wardrobe into Narnia, and it's like anything's possible now. There's a whole new reality I've got to consider, because I believe passionately that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is good news like that. It makes that total emotional difference for every person in every way. So I'm really interested in the emotional force of these arguments. So today we're going to talk about a moral argument, an abductive moral argument. And I want to begin like this. There was an article written back in 1979 by Arthur Leff in the Duke Law Journal. And it's gotten very famous. It's often quoted these days. And he's basically wrestling with this classic challenge that we face whenever we get into the moral argument of we want some kind of transcendent foundation for morality, some kind of transcendent basis for distinguishing between good and evil. But if we don't have God, who has traditionally been taken to play that role, at least for most civilizations in some way or another, then where do we find that foundation? And he's going on about this, and you can feel how he's wrestling with it. And I really appreciate his honesty in the way that he's wrestling with it. At one point he says the so-called death of God turns out to be not just his funeral, it also seems to have affected the total elimination of any coherent or even more than momentarily convincing ethical or legal system. He calls this the grand says who problem, that about any moral judgment you make, you can always ask, says who? I want to read you how he concludes the article because it's an amazingly emotional ending. He says, all I can say is this, it looks as if we are all that we have. Given what we know about ourselves and each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears as if all men are brothers. The ruling model is Cain and Abel. As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. And then he concludes the whole article with a sort of poem. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Starving the wicked is okay. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amin, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned salvation. Those who acquiesced deserved to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. All together now, says who? God help us. And that is an interesting conclusion to have in an academic article, and a lot of people have noted that and found it significant, and I find it significant, and I appreciate his honesty. And I think probably all of us can relate to the feelings that he's tapping into there. These basic moral principles, most of us would say, yeah, of course that's wrong. In fact, a lot of us would say that's really something that's so obviously wrong that it's almost offensive to think we would need to justify that claim. Because almost everybody would say, yes, napalming babies is bad. And where there are people like the reality of psychopathy who don't have basic moral instincts, at least in the same way, traditionally that's been understood as a personality disorder because these feelings are so basic to our humanity. We were swimming in the pool last night with our kids, and I was thinking about this, and the thought finally came to me that being a theist kind of makes it more comfortable to live within your humanity because you don't have to question these basic, most interior instincts that we have about things like morality and other things as well. So the question is, what's the best way to account for those feelings? We all have those deep, powerful moral instincts. And I just want to propose two options today, and then we'll be in abductive reasoning mode, thinking what's the best way to account for this. These are not exhaustive options, so my comments today are not an exhaustive account of this whole topic. But I want to kind of probe the difference between naturalism and supernaturalism. I just mean by those, naturalism, the view that nature is all there is. Only physical things exist. And supernaturalism being the worldview that there is something beyond nature, usually understood to be God, though not always. And I'll be thinking specifically of theism today. And basically what I want to do is just walk through a series of anecdotes from literature and from movies, and each time go into abductive mode and say, what's the best way to explain this? And I'm going to propose that supernaturalism of some kind is far better equipped to explain each of these things that we'll talk about. And we'll start with a basic point about movies. So last time I was here, we talked about how movies always have the same basic plot line. It's good and evil fighting. And sometimes that's so common we don't even think about it. We just assume, well, of course, a movie is going to be about good and evil. And usually the shape of the story takes place like this, where good is often the underdog, usually is losing for most of the movie, usually has some kind of institutional disadvantage. Usually there's love and sacrifice and suffering along the way, and then good wins in the end. And I'll call that happy endings. A happy ending is when good beats evil. And that's basically the plot line of all the movies we see. Whether it's Rocky Balboa fighting the Russian, one of my favorites, or the rebels fighting Darth Vader, or infinite different variations, but it's the same basic theme. And every now and again you find a movie that doesn't have a happy ending. And we talked about this movie last time called The Gray, which came out in 2011, where I said more last time, so I won't really say a whole lot about this movie, except that the basic idea is it's an exploration of death and nihilism. Because and everything about the movie, from the setting in Alaska, where these oil workers are stranded and they're being hunted by wolves, to the plot, to the dialogue, to the music, to the flashbacks, is all highlighting the sadness of death. And it doesn't have a happy ending. And it's interesting to me that whenever you watch a movie that doesn't have a happy ending, we often feel kind of cheated at the end. Has anyone else ever experienced that? You're like, I paid $12 for this, or however much they charge you now, and it doesn't have a happy ending. If something about that feels wrong to us. And this is one of those movies, and I want to reference, I won't get too much into the content this time because we did last time, but I want to reference how Roger Ebert, the film critic, responded to this movie. Because in his review of The Grey, he said that for the first time, the unrelenting darkness of a movie made me unable to watch the next movie. Sometimes as a movie critic, you watch multiple movies in a row. And he had two in a row. This was the first one. And he said this: "After this film, I was stunned with despair. It so happened that there were 2 movies scheduled that day. After The Grey was over, I watched the second film for 30 minutes and then got up and walked out of the theater. It was the first time I've ever walked out of a film because of the previous film. The way I was feeling in my gut, it just wouldn't have been fair to the next film." And he goes on, he's summarizing the plot for a while, and he finishes his review with these words: "The Grey advances with pitiless logic. There are more wolves than men. The men have weapons, the wolves have patience, the weather is punishing. I sat regarding the screen with mounting dread. The movie had to have a happy ending, didn't it?" And all of us, I think, can relate to that feeling when you're watching a movie that doesn't have a happy ending, like, surely it won't all go bad in the end, right? And I'm interested in that feeling. And I'm interested to go into abductive mode with that feeling and say, why do we have this deep longing for happy endings? Why are unhappy endings so emotionally unsatisfying? And by the way, I think that even the film The Grey itself is unsatisfied with an unhappy ending. And if all I'll say about that is watch through the credits, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So here's 2 ways we could answer that question. Why do we love happy endings? Well, in a naturalistic worldview, the longing for happy endings is a byproduct of our evolutionary history. At the end of the day, it's just there because it helped animals survive. So our consciences are basically telling us a false tale. They function as they do for reproductive ends, and they've been winnowed in that way for unimaginable eons of natural selection, passing on our genes the driving force. And what that means is our feeling about morality, the sense of transcendence and significance of good versus evil, is ultimately an illusion. Sometimes people call it a useful fiction. Daniel Dennett, who's a skeptic, says from a Darwinian perspective, the notion of individual rights is what he calls nonsense on stilts. And then he says, but it's a happy nonsense, because it helps us not to kill each other. Here's how Edward Wilson and Michael Ruse put it. They say morality, or more strictly our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. Ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes in order to get us to cooperate. So the feeling of illusion comes in that the sense of transcendence that accompanies good versus evil is not really connected to anything transcendent. So it's an illusion in this way that when you're in the midst of a moral struggle, it feels significant, it feels ultimate, but it only is, in fact, useful for making you pass on your genes. So that's the illusion. Mark Linville puts it like this. He says, on naturalism, our moral beliefs are evolutionary means to non-moral reproductive ends. And one way of showing that is that we can observe that we could have evolved differently. And many animal species have. It's far from certain that in every circumstance, benevolence would have survival value. And many animal species, for example, don't love their sexual partner, they eat their sexual partner. It's called sexual cannibalism, and you see it in octopuses and praying mantises and various kinds of spiders and scorpions. Charles Darwin recognized this point. He said, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Sorry for the heavy topic right after lunch. I know I think it's actually helpful to feel the horror of that. Because here's the point. On naturalism, there's no escape from that. There's nothing outside the system to pass judgment on the evolutionary process and say it went in a good way or a bad way. That evolutionary process is itself the sum total explanation. So when a shark eats a seal, no one says the shark is doing something wrong. Or when a Venus flytrap liquidates a bug, no one says, well, that's going to be brought up on Judgment Day. And so also with the sum total of human history. When Elie Wiesel talks about losing his faith during the Holocaust, illusion. It's just the strong devour the weak, that's the sum total. And I think it's helpful to press into that answer to that question, and my feeling about it personally is yikes, This naturalism is a pretty grisly worldview. It means that all the movies we're watching that are telling us about good triumphing over evil are really telling us a false story, because my own death will be the end of me, and then the heat death of the universe will be the end of every consequence from my life and every memory of my life. So there is no ultimate happy ending. On the other hand, what if you look at it in a supernaturalistic view, for instance, theism? In that case, you can actually see your moral instincts as a clue, not an illusion, a window out into ultimate reality. And this is where I was thinking last night, you can be more comfortable within your humanity as a theist. J.B. Phillips puts it like this: why is there this almost universal moral sense? Why do we consider that good is a better thing than evil? Surely this recognition of good, so deeply rooted and so universal, is another far from negligible pointer to reality. So picking up on that word pointer there, we can think of a metaphor. If you imagine that there's a man who's been imprisoned for an extremely long amount of time, and he's wondering, is the outside world even out there? There's a window in the prison, and in one case it's an illusion. It's this beautiful, outward view into the ocean, crashing waves, blue water, it's beautiful. But it's an illusion. There's nothing really out there. On the other hand, now imagine that man is in the prison, he's looking out through the window, and it really is out there, and one day he'll get there. That's the difference that it makes, I think, to be a naturalist or to believe in a supernatural something with respect to our moral feelings. They're either, what if they're a clue? What if that deep feeling of transcendence, what if the feeling you get at the end of your favorite movie about a happy ending is a little clue about the meaning of everything? Which of those two alternatives is more plausible to our hearts and to our minds? Now, there's a couple of different ways that people respond to this argument. And so what I want to do is walk through a couple of responses, and then we'll consider a couple of objections. A lot of people today would say, no, you can have morality without God. It's not so difficult a problem as you're making out. You can lose God, the metaphysical, and keep the ethical. And we'll address that a little bit more at the end. But I just think it's helpful to point out that historically, a lot of philosophers have seen very clearly that the loss of God doesn't mean business as usual for ethics. And especially when you get back to some of the classic atheists of the 19th century and the 20th century, I think they had a lot of courage to look into that worldview and really look through to the implications of where it leads. One of those whom I admire for his honesty and for his courage in this sense is Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, who was an atheist, and he put it very strongly of saying, moral judgments agree with religious judgments in that, in believing in realities which are no realities. So he's one who went the full way, and he said, yeah, not only are our moral instincts an illusion, so is our belief in God, and they kind of go together. And there's this famous passage in his book, The Gay Science, where he's talking about what is the result of that. When you lose God, what happens? It's the famous death of God passage where he envisions a character running into the marketplace and crying out, "Whither is God? I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? He goes on for a long time, and his conclusion is, God is dead and we have killed him. And those last little words that I ended the quote with here, to try to squeeze it into the PowerPoint, I think that's how a lot of people feel today. Is there still any up or down? And I think he saw pretty clearly, these images he's using about being untethered from the sun, wiping away the horizon. These are powerful images of the sense of chaos that ensues once you fully embrace a naturalistic worldview, I would say. And I've reflected a lot on just how poignant it is. Nietzsche himself, the often repeated story of sort of the end of his life or the beginning of the end. In 1889, he's 44 years old and he's walking the streets in Turin, Italy, and no one knows exactly what happened, but one of the common stories is that he sees a horse being whipped cruelly by the master, and he runs over to it in rage, wraps his arms around the horse to protect it, and then eventually breaks down into tears. And that was the day that he sort of lost his mental faculties and never recovered them. It's an extremely poignant and sad story, and my heart kind of goes out to him. In the 20th century in France, a little bit later, Jean-Paul Sartre was another very honest atheist who fully stepped into the implications, I think, of his atheism, because he's disputing with people who wanted to build a secular morality, and he, who called himself an existentialist, people are saying, well, it doesn't really matter if you lose God. You can still basically have business as usual with the rest of your life, even apart from God. And he was saying, no, we find it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. And I think that in a naturalistic worldview, that's a really good question. What is there within that worldview that would make moral duties and values objective? That is to say, the same irrespective of human opinion. What is it to ground what right and wrong are as stable? It's the age-old question of how do you get an ought from an is? And that's a really good question. Now I want to give you one more anecdote of someone who's wrestled with this question, perhaps just as poignantly, just as profoundly, and this is moving back to the 19th century and over to Russia. And Dostoevsky, the writer, is often referenced. In fact, let me wait to put up this quote just a second. Sorry for the false start there. He's often quoted for his famous quote, "If God does not exist, all things are possible." Very powerful. His book, The Brothers Karamazov, I will never forget, in the spring of 2010, we lived in Washington, D.C., and I was out on my bike a lot and then walking a lot in the neighborhoods of Capitol Hill and listening to an audio version of this book. So now whenever I hear it quoted, the accent of the reader comes back to my mind, and I vividly remember the book, and especially Book 5, chapters 3 to 5, where the character Ivan, who's a skeptic, gives the most powerful and heartrending expression of the problem of evil that I've ever encountered. It's so powerfully and forcefully articulated that you wonder, and I wondered, is this what Dostoevsky himself thinks? Because as you read the remainder of the story, that argument gets no counter-argument. There's nothing that is said that logically meets Ivan's view that I can detect. Someone else, if you know of it, let me know. I've just listened to this book one time through, so I may have missed something. But what struck me is this: Ivan focuses on the suffering of children in his speech. And that's one of the reasons why it is so poignant. One day I came home and I was researching about Dostoevsky's life, and I learned that the writing of this novel was interrupted in May of 1878 by the death of his 3-year-old son, Alyosha. Alyosha, of course, is the name of the hero of the book. So I'm reading Ivan's argument and I'm feeling it, and I'm thinking, I think Dostoevsky felt what he was saying through Ivan. I can't quote a lot of it because a lot of it is so disturbing and terrible, but one of the things he says is, Ivan is talking, he says, can you understand why a little creature who can't even understand what's done to her should beat her little aching heart with her tiny fist in the dark and the cold and weep her meek, unresentful tears to dear, kind God to protect her? Do you understand why this infamy must be and is permitted? And then he anticipates what Alyosha will say. Alyosha actually doesn't say much in this speech. He just listens, which is a good thing to do often. He says, without it, I am told, man could not have existed on earth, for he could not have known good and evil. Why should he know that diabolical good and evil when it costs so much? Why, the whole world of knowledge is not worth that child's prayer to dear, kind God. You feel that as you're reading through the book. The problem is that although his argument is not answered, the events of the story undermine Ivan's philosophy. Because basically what happens is their brother, Alyosha and Ivan are brothers, their other brother uses that philosophy to justify his own murder of their father. And when Ivan realizes his own complicity in his father's murder, he has a mental breakdown. And Alyosha, who's the character who represents faith in God and simple love for others, becomes the hero of the story. And it looks like, to me, like what Dostoevsky is saying is he's critiquing Ivan not through logic, but through the plot and through the narrative. And he's saying, look what this leads to. When I finished the book, I wrote down this sentence in the back: however difficult faith in God may be when faced with the terrible reality of suffering in this world, its only alternative is an unlivable despair. Now let me conclude by mentioning some objections. And then we'll pick up, I realize that's a heavy note there, but I think it sometimes is helpful to feel the weight of this topic, because it is a weighty topic. So let me mention a few objections, and then we'll pick up on that note, that heavy note, and end it on a personal note, okay? One of the most common objections to the moral argument is when people basically say, but look at all the bad things that religion does. If you watch the debate between Christopher Hitchens and William Lane Craig at Biola, that's where I think Hitchens is at his most rhetorically powerful, when he's cataloging religious violence and saying, look at all this, how dare you say you need God for morality, look what that leads to, and so forth. And I want to say that I think we should engage that objection sensitively, compassionately, and really listen and thoughtfully, I hope. But I also think it's important to point out that that's actually not an objection to the moral argument, at least as I've given it and as most have given it, because the moral argument doesn't say that people who believe in God will be more moral. That's a sociological question. It doesn't say that people who believe in God will know morality better. That's an epistemological question. It doesn't say that religions professing God preceded morality. That's a historical question. This argument poses an ontological question, and that is, where does morality itself come from? And I think a great direction to push those conversations is, on what basis can we object to religious violence if we lose this moral framework? In his book, Making Sense of God, Tim Keller points out that not only can you, by common experience, realize that it's not necessarily the case that theists are always more moral people, he says that Christians have additional reasons to doubt such a statement, because the New Testament teaches, on the one hand, that all persons, regardless of belief, are created by God with a moral conscience, Romans 2:14. And on the other hand, the same text tells them that all people, including believers, are flawed sinners, Romans 3:9 through 12. So I think, as a Christian, I approach conversations with the expectation that there's going to be good and bad in all of us. There will be dignity in the worst of us and depravity in the best of us. As Solzhenitsyn put it, the line of good and evil is drawn through every single heart. And I think that's a helpful way to redirect back to the real issue. What is the ontological basis for morality itself? Now, another common response that you hear a lot of times is that evolution can fully account for our morality. And I think it's helpful to point out when you're dealing with this objection that it is, I think, an example of what is commonly called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is the error of thinking that if you explain the origin of something, you can judge its validity. So, for example, if I say, my friend told me that Pluto is not a planet, my friend is a liar, therefore Pluto is a planet, that's a logical fallacy because I'm evaluating the claim not on its truth, but on who told me about it. And this whole issue, I think, this objection falls into that error because the question of how our moral instincts developed over time is a separate issue from the ontological basis for our moral instincts and for moral values and duties. In their book, Good God, David Daggett and Jerry Walls address this point, and they say at most, evolution can tell us about the knowledge of morality, not about morality itself. They say an evolutionary account of feelings or beliefs in, say, moral obligation is certainly possible, but how would naturalism explain obligation itself? I think that's just a helpful thing to perhaps reference when we're dialoguing with people about this topic. Now, I have a few more notes about other objections that Sam Harris gives and others, but I'm going to skip them now. So many of them just boil down to, I think, confusing how we know morality with what is the ontological basis for morality. So I'm just going to skip to this final objection, which is the Euthyphro dilemma. This goes all the way back to Plato, and this is, you hear this all the time, so it's good to be prepared for it, where the character Euthyphro says, is the good loved by the gods because it is good, or is it good because it is loved by the gods? And this is one of the reasons people say that you can't base morality upon God, because either way you go there, you run into troubles. If something is good just because God decided it should be good, then goodness becomes arbitrary. If something is good because God recognized it was good, then there's something independent of God. And so people use this objection to say morality and goodness can't come from God. And I would respond to this by saying, I think that the Euthyphro dilemma gives us a false contrast because it gives you two options and makes you choose between them, but there may be other options. It doesn't give you mutually exhaustive options. So what if, for example, morality depends upon God, not by his choice, but based upon his character? And this would be the traditional Christian view that the good is actually identical with God. But it's surprising how much you see the Euthyphro dilemma trotted out as if it's a powerful response, and I think it's just good to be prepared for that and ready to respond to that. Now, let me conclude so we have time for Q&A and we can interact. I want to conclude in a personal way because I recognize, especially with the heaviness of that Dostoevsky quote, which hit me even more as I was reading it today than it has previously. I recognize that this topic is both personal and philosophical. It's both local and global, so to speak. And all of us wrestle with it at a profound level personally, as well as thinking about it in the context of apologetics and philosophy and so forth. So I want to conclude on a personal note and just ask the question, what does Christianity offer to us when we are personally struggling with the problem of evil? And I'll just say two things to conclude. The first is that Christianity allows us to grieve and to truly feel the terribleness of evil, to truly lament evil as a really bad thing. and that whatever the Christian answer is, it can't be and it isn't, just kind of glibly sliding over the real challenge. And I take heart that people like Dostoevsky are, they're truly facing the problem at the deepest possible emotional and personal level. And I believe that for the Ivans and the Nietzsches of the world, they can actually find a lot in the Bible that will be sympathetic to their plight. Because in the Bible you have the prophets like Habakkuk crying out, "How long, O Lord?" And then God's answer isn't exactly reassuring to them. You have Job and his unbelievable wrestling with God. You have a book like Ecclesiastes and the almost sense of despair that that book leaves you with, and I say almost. And then, of course, you have the cross itself, where Jesus himself cries out, "God, why?" Quoting Psalm 22, but nonetheless, he quoted that psalm at that moment. And I think that what we have in the Christian gospel is something that, whatever else it does to us, allows us to weep when there's evil. That's not the full answer, but it's a pretty important step along the way, I feel. When I was writing my review or my engagement with de Grey, I wrote these words: "It seems to me that the Christian and the nihilist can walk together a long way, side by side, in mutual defiance of evil, mutual resignation to fight it to the last choking breath. The Christian view acknowledges that evil is indeed staggering, unthinkable, blinding, oppressive. The Christian, I think, can weep with each dying character. He can walk into the wolf nest with the same grim determination that Liam Neeson shows. He can recite with full conviction, 'Do not go gentle into that good night.' His grief is not less severe than that of the nihilist." And I go on to say, I think he knows a little bit more of why it hurts so bad. But lastly and secondly, I think Christianity offers us, when we are suffering evil, with hope. If I could boil down Christianity into one word that I would want to extend to my non-Christian friends, my sort of lost, postmodern, questioning type friends, it would be the word hope. This Easter, and I'll leave you with this, I preached a sermon on the resurrection of Jesus, and I quoted this, my favorite scene in all literature, where Sam is reunited with Gandalf, whom he thought was dead, and he can't speak because he's so happy. And he says, "Gandalf, I thought you were dead. Is everything sad going to come untrue?" And it says, Gandalf laughed, and the sound of it fell upon his ears like the echo of all the joys he had ever known. And then it says, but he himself burst into tears and said, "I feel like spring after winter, and the sun on the leaves, and like trumpets and harps and all the songs I have ever heard." And that happy ending makes me wonder, maybe the reason we love happy endings so much is that one day there's going to be one. So thank you guys for listening.